While we await that news conference, which again will happen sometime this hour, let's talk about some of the other news that's been breaking tonight, including some surprising news from the courts that has to do with one of the senior figures from the Trump campaign who's currently awaiting sentencing on felony charges. You might remember this time last week, we got word of a new indictment related to the Trump campaign. This man, Stephen Kalk, was the head of a small bank in Chicago that was supposed to be a bank that catered to veterans. Now, during the Trump campaign, he turned his bank instead into the bank that allegedly bribed the Trump campaign chairman, Paul Manafort. And you might remember some of the storytelling from Manafort's trial. Manafort was in sort of a sticky wicket, financially speaking, during the campaign. He went to this little bank in Chicago that, again, specializes in loans to veterans. Manafort isn't a veteran. But he asked for loans that he financially probably should not have been approved for. Bank employees objected to his loan applications, but the head of the bank, Stephen Kalk, interceded and said that Manafort should get the loans. Even when Manafort was caught falsifying documents to support the loan applications, even when he admitted to misstating his assets and his liabilities, Kalk said it was all fine with him, no problem, he greenlit those loans all the way. Now, why was Stephen Kalk so excited to give away so much of his little bank's money to Paul Manafort, who, again, was not a veteran, and who was asking the bank for so much money? Manafort would ultimately become their single largest borrower, and he would lose the bank millions and millions of dollars. Why was Stephen Kalk, the head of that bank, so psyched to do that? Well, according to the indictment against Kalk, he was so psyched to do that because Manafort was accepting these millions of dollars in loans from Stephen Kalk's bank, basically as bribes, because Manafort was hooking Stephen Kalk up with the Trump campaign. And this was the part that was sort of pitiful, right? I mean, you may remember our earlier reporting on this show about the document that Stephen Kalk sent over to Paul Manafort listing all the prospective roles he might want in the new administration. That's literally how he spelled it. Perspective, P-E-R, perspective, and then rolls, like dinner rolls or somersaults. The list of his prospective roles in the Trump campaign or the Trump administration included 10 different cabinet positions. Wow. Or ambassador to any number of these 18 awesome countries, starting with the UK, second place France. I mean, sky's the limit, right? This guy was giving the Trump campaign chairman millions of dollars. Why shouldn't he get to be Deputy Secretary of Defense or Secretary of Commerce for that? But the specific job that Manafort appears to have led this guy to think he was getting in exchange for these millions of dollars, the specific job he really thought he was going to get was Secretary of the Army. We know that because at one point, Mr. Kalk reportedly called the Pentagon asking them why he wasn't getting his briefings already, given that he was the incoming Secretary of the Army. He assured them, in fact, that he had his whole senior staff all ready to go. Who should they call to get their names on their doors? I mean, it's pitiful, this whole sordid allegation, but it happened. They really did try to do it. I mean, bribing the Trump campaign chairman wasn't like a con. It was kind of a good investment for a while. I mean, Manafort really did get Stephen Kalk a gig on the Trump campaign as an economic advisor to the campaign. That happened. And Stephen Kalk really did get a high-level job interview at the Pentagon. I mean, the Trump campaign was apparently well-wired to pay off arrangements like this. Kalk's indictment this past week shows how Manafort sent Jared Kushner, also known as Transition Official Number 1, he sent Jared Kushner a recommendation that Mr. Kalk be appointed Secretary of the Army. The next day, Jared Kushner, in fact, forwarded this recommendation to 3 other representatives of the transition team, recommending, in fact, that Kalk be considered. Remember, this is at a time when Manafort had been kicked off the Trump campaign because of what was revealed about his secret ties to Ukrainian oligarchs and Russian interests. But apparently, he's still deciding who's going to be Secretary of the Army. Manafort, after he contacted Jared Kushner, apparently felt that things weren't going fast enough. So he then contacted Transition Official Number 2 to arrange, in fact, an interview of Stephen Kalk to be Secretary of the Army. According to the Kalk indictment, this was while Manafort had another $6.5 million in loans pending from Kalk's bank. And apparently he really wanted to hurry that money along. Quote, Transition Official 2 advised Manafort that another candidate was likely to be nominated for Secretary of the Army, but agreed to arrange for Mr. Kalk to be interviewed for undersecretary instead. undersecretary. So he didn't get to be Secretary of the Army in exchange for bribing Paul Manafort, but he did get an interview to be undersecretary, the #2 civilian job in the United States Army. Because, according to prosecutors, that's what he believed bribing the Trump campaign chair would pay for. Quote, after the $6.5 million loans closed, as arranged by Transition Official 2, Koch, in fact, interviewed for Undersecretary of the Army. The interview took place on or about January 10th, 2017. It was conducted by 3 representatives of the presidential transition team at the transition team's Manhattan offices. So we got that indictment last week. That indictment last week is about what you could apparently get from the Trump campaign and the Trump transition if you paid bribes to the Trump campaign chairman during the campaign. That was last week. Today, we got newly unsealed documents related to Trump National Security Advisor Mike Flynn, who is now awaiting sentencing. They also pertain to Flynn's business partner, who served as a senior official in the Trump transition and who is himself currently awaiting trial. These new documents show that during the campaign, not only was the Trump campaign's top national security advisor secretly on the payroll of another country, but the deliverables he was expected to produce for that foreign paycheck included statements by the Republican presidential candidate defending that foreign country and publicly raising questions about a citizen of that country who lives in the United States that foreign country wanted to smear. They were complaining, that foreign country was complaining that Flynn hadn't delivered on that yet. Because apparently Flynn was secretly being paid by that foreign country to make that happen. I mean, we knew before that Flynn was paid by that foreign country, he was paid by Turkey, to do things like write op-eds defending the Turkish government and attacking this guy they wanted extradited who lived in the United States. Flynn definitely did that for money. He compared the guy to Osama bin Laden and then cashed the check for it. But now we know he was also paid to get presidential candidate Donald Trump to make pro-Turkish statements and to raise questions about the same guy they wanted smeared during the campaign. And because of these newly unsealed documents today, we also now know that he was paid by that foreign country during the campaign to try to find, quote, links/trails to the Clinton Foundation and the Clinton campaign as well, to try to link this Turkish guy living in the United States to terrorism. Right? They're calling him a new bin Laden. They want to link this Turkish guy living in the United States to terrorism, and then they want to link him to the Clinton campaign to hurt Clinton. So that particular tactic against Clinton during the campaign, that was bought and paid for by the government of a foreign country, by the government of Turkey, through its paid secret agent who was Trump's national security advisor, and through the #2 guy running the Trump transition on intelligence issues, who was also secretly employed by that foreign country the whole time. I mean, Attorney General Bill Barr doing this new. It was inexplicable. It was maybe just short of treasonous that the FBI might have wanted to take a look at anything involving the Trump campaign. Yeah, I can't imagine why they might have wanted to do that. I mean, the campaign chairman quit after it was revealed that he was secretly on the payroll of Ukrainian oligarchs and Russian interests. The Justice Department now says he was accepting millions of dollars in bribes in exchange for selling off one of the top civilian jobs in the U.S. Army. One Trump foreign policy advisor, Carter Page, was believed by the FBI to be an active agent of the Russian government, and they took their suspicions to a federal judge to prove it. Another of the Trump foreign policy advisors had weeks of advance notice that the Russians had stolen Democratic files and emails even before anybody else publicly knew that. And his national security advisor, his top national security advisor during the campaign, the guy who eventually named national security advisor in the White House, literally was a secret paid foreign agent during the campaign and beyond. And then the Russians started helping that campaign, and members of the campaign and the candidate's family started taking secret meetings with emissaries from the Russian government. Yeah, how dare the FBI take a look at that? I mean, they must have been anti-Trump fanatics. Why would anybody see anything suspicious in that series of characters and events? That's just deep state wahooism. Anyway, So the number 2 guy on intelligence in the Trump transition, the guy who brags on his LinkedIn page to this day about his role in selecting the CIA director during the Trump transition, he is now awaiting trial. It's due to start this summer. That's where we got these new details today from the court about what Turkey thought they were getting from him and from Mike Flynn, from the people they were paying on the Trump campaign and the Trump transition. Flynn himself is awaiting sentencing. He'll be back in court before the judge in his case in a couple of weeks. But on that point, as of tonight, I think it's also fair to say that Flynn is awaiting what we expect could be a brand new explosion of temper from the judge in his case, and it won't be the first time. A couple of weeks ago, the judge in the Michael Flynn case ordered prosecutors to release 3 sets of documents related to Flynn's case. The first was the transcript of a voicemail that one of the president's lawyers had left for Flynn's lawyer around the time everybody started to realize that Flynn was going to plead guilty and become a cooperator. We had seen bits and pieces of the transcript of that voicemail in the Mueller report, in the section on potential criminal obstruction of justice by the president. The pieces of that transcript in the Mueller report read, and I remember reporting this at the time, right after the report came out, that voicemail read like a kind of mafia-esque threat to Michael Flynn through his attorney saying, hey, we know you're going to cooperate. We got to know what you're going to give them on the president. I mean, the or else was silent, but it was implied. I say that this is sort of a mafia-esque thing as it appears in the Mueller report because it literally starts with the president's lawyer saying, let me see if I can't state it in starker terms. Have you ever had like a pleasant conversation, a non-threatening conversation with somebody that started that way? I mean, maybe if you had a painter, if I could paint this for you in starker terms. Anyway, so we had seen portions of that voicemail. We had not seen the entire thing. But 2 weeks ago, the judge in the Flynn case ordered prosecutors to make that full transcript public. That was the first thing he ordered to be made public. The second thing he asked for, the second thing he told prosecutors to release to the public, were the transcripts of Flynn's calls with the Russians, the transcripts of Flynn's calls about sanctions with the Russian ambassador during the presidential transition. These are the calls that Flynn pled guilty to lying to the FBI about. The third thing the judge ordered to be released to the public was all the portions of the Mueller report that have to do with Michael Flynn. The judge said anything about Flynn that's redacted in the report needs to be unredacted for the public now. Anything blacked out of the report about Flynn, remove those blackouts, show the public. So those were the 3 things. And those were not 3 requests from Flynn's judge. Those were 3 court orders for the voicemail, for the calls with the Russians, and for unredacting the Mueller report. Well, today was the deadline for prosecutors to hand that stuff over. And it kind of didn't happen. The first one happened. Prosecutors did turn over the full transcript of that voicemail from the president's lawyer, who we now know is John Dowd. Now that we have the full transcript, it does paint an even clearer picture of how the president's attorney was, in fact, calling over to Mike Flynn, calling Flynn's lawyers, to ask what Flynn knew about the president and what he was going to tell prosecutors about the president and how Flynn should know how the president felt about him. I mean, it does not change the tone, but we get more of it. Quote, I understand your situation, but let me see if I can't state it in starker terms. Who talks like that? It wouldn't surprise me if you've gone on to make a deal with and work with the government. If there's information that implicates the president, we need some kind of heads up just for the sake of protecting all our interests. Remember what we've always said about the president and his feelings for Flynn, but, well, we know from the Mueller report what happened after that voicemail. I mean, we can now see the full transcript of it. We know from Mueller's account around describing the incidents around that voicemail, we know what happened. Here's how Mueller describes it. Quote, Flynn's attorneys returned the call from the president's counsel. Flynn's attorneys reiterated that they were no longer in a position to share information under any sort of privilege. According to Flynn's attorneys, the president's counsel was indignant and vocal in his disagreement. The president's counsel said that he interpreted what they said to him as a reflection of Flynn's hostility towards the president and that he planned to inform his client, meaning he planned to inform the president of that interpretation. Flynn's attorneys understood that statement to be an attempt to make them reconsider their position, meaning reconsider their decision for Flynn to start cooperating with the government. So I mean, needless to say, trying to intimidate witnesses, trying to prevent witnesses from cooperating with the government. That is part of how you explain obstruction of justice to 3-year-olds, right? That's why that voicemail was part of Robert Mueller's obstruction of justice investigation into the president. Well, now we've got the full transcript of that voicemail. This is how CNN and their excellent justice reporter Caitlin Polantz headlined that news tonight. Quote, transcript released of Flynn voicemail from Trump lawyer showing possible attempt to obstruct. And that's exactly what it is. This is really interesting. That voicemail transcript, that was only the first of 3 things that the judge ordered the government to hand over today. The other 2, the transcripts of Flynn's calls with the Russians and the Flynn portions of the redacted Mueller report, prosecutors basically took that order from the judge and said, no, Your Honor, you're not getting that. I didn't even know you could do that. I mean, today, prosecutors told the judge they wouldn't give the judge the transcript of Michael Flynn's calls with the Russian ambassador. They wouldn't give those transcripts to the judge or to the public, nor would they turn over anything else from the redacted Mueller report that talks about Flynn. They told the judge in a written motion that all of the information in the Mueller report relating to Michael Flynn has already been unredacted, every word of it. And that those other calls that he asked for, the ones between Flynn and the Russian ambassador talking about sanctions, this is a strange argument. Prosecutors basically told the judge that he shouldn't want to see those because they're not relevant. They're not relevant to Flynn's sentencing, which is the portion of this case that they're in now. I mean, this is weird, but this is what prosecutors said tonight in explaining to the judge why they weren't handing over the transcript of Flynn's calls with the Russians. This is the exact quote from them. The government is not relying on any other recordings of any person for purposes of establishing the defendant's guilt or determining his sentence, nor are there any other recordings that are part of the sentencing record. Which kind of seems like refrigerator poetry that's beside the point, but I mean, what they're telling the judge here is no, Your Honor, court order, schmort order. You can't see that. And this is kind of wild for a few reasons, right? I mean, first of all, it makes you wonder who's overseeing the Flynn prosecution at the Justice Department now. Has that changed? Also, judges' orders are not optional. When a judge orders you to do something, no matter which side of a case you're on, you have to do what the judge says. That's the whole point of a judge. They decide all the things about a case. Full stop. Prosecutors in particular usually try to avoid running afoul of a judge, particularly a judge they might have to appear before lots of times in the future. I mean, just on its face, it is a bold move by prosecutors here to refuse to turn over documents that the judge explicitly asked for. But it's also kind of hard to wrap your head around why prosecutors say those calls between Flynn and the Russian ambassador are irrelevant to the proof of Flynn's guilt or to Flynn's sentencing. I mean, when Mike Flynn made those calls to the Russian ambassador during the Trump transition, they talked about U.S. sanctions on Russia. Mike Flynn went on to lie about those conversations. He told FBI agents that he didn't discuss sanctions on those phone calls with Russia. I mean, that's the crime he pled guilty to, right? Lying to the FBI about those phone calls and what he talked to the Russian government about. And so presumably, if you are the government lawyers who are prosecuting this case, if you are trying to prove, right, that Michael Flynn lied on those phone calls, right, he's guilty of that. He lied when he said he was not talking about sanctions. Wouldn't a transcript or a recording of what actually happened on those phone calls kind of be the spine of your case in terms of demonstrating Flynn's guilt? Anyway, this was kind of the shock tonight in the Flynn case. It is still totally an open question as to what the judge will do about this now that the prosecutors in his court appear to be defying his order without much of an explanation. I mean, judges are not told no all that often. I'm not sure what exactly is going to happen next here, but I bet, based on which judge this is, it's going to happen fast. More ahead tonight. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.